I'm going to talk a little bit about the tensions that I think are there at the heart of the big society debate. For many people in the voluntary sector, the big society has been seen as a big opportunity. It's also, though, gone alongside the notion of the small state, and that meaning small resources. So I'm going to say a bit about big society and about the sector issues in it, a bit about some of the principles of the big society, something about the capacity of the third sector to be involved in and to deliver both health and social care and the big society, and then a small amount about our experience at WRVS. So the big society, and not being sector-specific. Now, with a health audience, that probably seems fairly obvious. You probably think it's about you. Well, everyone in the third sector thinks it's about them. And indeed, there are other people, like those in local authorities, who think it's about them too. So we have got an issue here where we've got a package, an envelope, which can be used to redescribe things that we're already doing. That isn't what it's meant to be about. But I think that within the third sector, which is the broad voluntary and community sector, there are, I think, not only people who believe that this is essentially our territory, and therefore have some difficulties of engaging in some of the debates about our collective territory with all the sectors working together. But also, I think there are some specific things where there are tensions between different parts of the government's agenda. In particular, if you look at much of the debate, from the discussion from the third sector ministers, those particularly Francis Maud and Nick Hurd in the Cabinet Office, who are talking as the ministers for civil society, with the responsibility for delivering David Cameron's legacy item, the big society, you'll see that they come up and talk about 3 or 4 specific things. One is creating the capacity, a freeing up of communities to be able to be more self-sustaining. Second is about trying to create the capacity for third sector bodies, civil society bodies, to have access to capital, and in doing so creating the big society bank. Thirdly, trying to look at how can we make it more possible for voluntary sector organisations to be set up in the first place, and then having been set up, to be effectively governed and to run well. And for that there is a task force on which I sit, which is about lifting the burdens of red tape on voluntary organisations, charities and social enterprises. It's also seen as being very much about that notion of mutuality, of self-help, of interdependence, and of very small local initiatives. These have been provided by big citizens or volunteers. For the sector, it has seemed like a green light for growth, for expansion, and certainly Francis Maud and Nick Hurd, in talking up the big society and the role of the third sector, the voluntary and community sector, appear to be delivering on what have been a range of pre-election promises about creating a level playing field for voluntary organisations and creating an important and effective role, specifically to support the development and improvement of civil society organisations and voluntary organisations. No wonder the voluntary sector has taken this to heart. No wonder the voluntary sector has seen this as being a great opportunity for growth and development. There is a fly in the ointment, and that is it's being done alongside no money. And I think that part of the change and the change perception within the voluntary sector is about moving itself from a mentality which is about thinking about funding as being something that comes through grants to being something that needs to be earned. And that change is a focus that I'm going to come to in a moment. It's also, and I think this is slowly dawning on the voluntary sector, not sector-specific. It is about local government, and it is certainly in the health services also about looking at different forms of structure. And I know Ali will be talking about the whole world of mutualism and social enterprise. But I think there is a tension. There is a sense in which big is no longer seen as beautiful at all. and the very small is what's valued. That, I think, has real problems. It certainly has problems in terms of looking at the types of provision that can be provided by the third sector, because certainly in terms of health services, you need to be able to go to scale. You need to be able to do this at a national level. So, carrying on as I try to do in having Red Queen moments, I'm trying to believe several impossible things before breakfast. We've had a great breakfast. But can we find a way of bringing together these various different principles? Localism, decentralisation, transparency and accountability. Then on another side, the whole development of personalisation, of tailoring services to individuals, increasingly important in both health and social care. How does that link with putting power in the hands of the citizens and people, both as those who provide the service and those who use services? And perhaps I think a different way of looking at the citizen as being someone who actually is a contributor, and this is where we get to the power of the new voluntarism. It's also about increasing democratic legitimacy and creating more citizen involvement. It's about, and this is where local government thinks it's all about them, it's about a role for local government in setting the framework. So I think there is an increased role for the third sector in creating this accessible new type of service that is personalised, is tailored to people's needs, that does link into the local communities, that creates the untapped power of citizens. There's so much in it for us all. I do tend to think when there's so much potential, there's a bit of a trap here. However, before getting to some of those traps, let me say something a little bit more about the potential, because I do actually think that there is great potential for the voluntary sector to be more engaged and to be able to build the capacity that will enable it to be the sort of partner in delivering both a personal and tailored social care and healthcare system and those wider ambitions of the big society. The first is that the third sector has had to learn another language. We've had to become much better at talking the language of commodification. And we have done a huge amount to do that. Organisations like mine, but also like many others, have put a huge amount of effort into actually really understanding, first of all, outcomes, but then in framing the activities that we create and that we undertake into the sorts of products that can then be demonstrated to achieve impacts and can be shown to have values, which are monetary values, as well as social values. We've become much better at basic things like commodifying, at costing, at pricing, and indeed charging for these products and outcomes. We've done work which is about developing social impact and actually quantifying and putting value onto the difference that we make. And now the movement towards looking at social return on investment means that voluntary organisations are absolutely getting a grip on being able to monetize and express the value of what they do in financial models. We're recognising the tension that does exist between trying to be very local and to go to scale, about being involved in process, personalisation, enabling people to work together, to be able to define for themselves their products, that they want the outcomes that they need, and being able to do that in a way that goes to scale and can create national impact. As a result, voluntary sector organisations are working in consortia and are developing new sorts of third sector consortia, but also working in consortia with the private sector. Indeed, some, but that's a much more traditional route with the public sector. We are developing new approaches to commissioning, new approaches that will enable us to work in a different way. And I think that some of the things in the white paper about any willing provider and creating a level playing field actually do play to the strengths of the voluntary sector in the health and social care world. However, and I've tested it on a few people this morning, did you know there's also a commissioning white paper coming from the Cabinet Office? Some do, vast majority don't. And the commissioning white paper, I think, is at considerable odds with what's being debated about the whole certainly the development in any willing provider and the health world. It is about the commissioning white paper, about many things, but amongst other things, quite specifically, developing the capacity of the third sector to play a significant role. Briefly, to say something of our experience at WRVS. Some of you will know some of what we do, few of you will probably know it all. We are the largest provider of older people's services in the voluntary sector, providing practical services powered by volunteers. We've got about 55,000 volunteers. We're in 4,000 parts of the country. We are, at heart, about localism, about civil society. And what we can do, and we have done, is gone through all of our services and, in a sense, turned them into the sorts of products that can be examined and analysed. We have looked at the social impact of our services, and we started off looking particularly at Meals on Wheels, at community transport, at community centres, home from hospital services, and our hospital shops, which many of you will know. We talked to over 1,000 people. As a result of it, we know that we make life a lot better for at least 70% of the people, the older people that we work with, and that rises to 90% of those whose lives we make somewhat better. We know that 73% of people are less isolated as a result of our services, 63% more confident, 57% more independent, and 46% healthier. And none of those services that you heard me talk about were ones specifically focused on creating health outcomes, except for the home from hospital one, which you won't be surprised to discover had the highest rating of 81%. What I think is fascinating is that our hospital shops and cafes actually have 73% of people say they make their lives better, and they're healthier, more independent, greater dignity, more resilient as a result. What does that mean? What does that mean for us as an organisation? It means that we have got to turn the things that make the difference, not just selling articles, into other sorts of commodities. We need to be able to cost, price and charge for the additional value of those activities. And we can then use that knowledge with other organisations in consortia to develop pathways. For example, we're working with the Alzheimer's Society to develop preventative pathways around the sorts of things that we can do and we can do with others. It puts a value on what is currently under or not valued. It puts a financial value on it. And this is the connection to the big society. And this is the connection to the role of the third sector. Because once you start putting a commercial value, a commodity, onto those things like trust, interaction, relationships, the things that build community, once you put a value onto the fact that you have sustainable communities, once you put a monetary value onto all of that, you create a completely different relationship, and you do indeed create a market. That is why we are being approached by an awful lot of commercial organisations at the moment to work with them. Now, I'm not daft, and I know that many of the reasons many of these want to work with us is, to quote the chairman of one, is to soften the edges of their bid. If you are breaking up the NHS, one of the most trusted organisations in the country, doesn't it make sense to work with the most trusted and reliable brand as far as older people are concerned, WRVS? Of course it does. But that's not the only reason for doing it. It is because you can actually get into the sort of world where, when the NHS, as it may, simply becomes the brand on the front door, and all sorts of others, mutuals, indeed, social enterprises, indeed, but also private enterprise are delivering these things, doesn't it make sense to work with those that bring that added value of the big society? So, to conclude, big society is very much, as Matt was saying, about the connections that create and build society. It is about valuing social interaction. It is about creating mutuality and shared responsibility. Part of our role in the third sector is not just to sit back and say, thank you, this is our world, but actually to say, how do we value how do we put a monetary value on those things that we have taken for granted and that we have all taken for granted? And how do we do it in such a way that we can then deliver integrated health and social care services, putting people at the heart of it, creating the sorts of effective services people want, but do it in such a way that it also builds the ties, the connections, the sustainability and the resilience of society. Thank you.